them on the side. Okay, so the formal title's a little long, but what we're talking about is we're going to spend a little time progressing from a simulation course and some simulation theory into what became a really large interdisciplinary, interprofessional course that we brought into the clinical arena over the course of a few years. This built through. So first of all, thank you. I really appreciate being here. I really appreciate the kind introduction and the invitation. I love this stuff. I love talking to educators. So I'm going to indulge myself a few times today with some medical education. So I have no disclosures. There were some grants involved in this at times, but none of those were to me personally, and I have no financial interest in anything that I'm going to mention today whatsoever. Our objectives today, really to take a minute to talk about how simulation education concepts can be used as a foundation for a clinical team debriefing training session. How do we move concepts built in a sim lab in one particular kind of medical education into a larger, more clinical, more broadly applicable milieu? And thinking about some components of a teaching career. I want to talk a little bit about how I built this as part of my career, what I did with these things outside of the actual course itself, and used it to create academic product and other talks and other things that really helped my career as an educator, not just my students and teachers. So, my real objectives, I want to tell you a story. I like telling stories. This is a long story, but I think it's a good one. I want to sprinkle in, we're going to Salt Bay a little bit of adult learning theory along the way and learn a few lessons. I learned a lot of lessons from this, big, complicated process, a lot of things that went well, a lot of things we could have done better. I want to share those with all of you so you can learn from them and pick up from my mistakes. All right, so where did we start? This started quite a few years ago in a patient safety committee. For those of you who aren't aware, at least until recently, the hospital insurance company, so FOJP, they've had a variety of names over the years. Our hospitals, as well as a couple others, are self-insured. We sort of created our own malpractice insurance company. And what was really cool about that and ended up benefiting us quite a bit is when they didn't spend money on malpractice cases, right? When we did a good job and they had a little surplus, they gave it back to the system. And they gave it back to patient safety programming. And they were really interested in being sure that they gave those things back in a way that benefited faculty, that benefited patient safety, leading back to less malpractice and all those sort of things. But we got involved in that in the simulation subcommittee. They brought some of us simulation educators in to talk about, are there things that simulation could do for safety, for the faculty? Lots of places, students and residents and GME folks use simulation. It's become very ubiquitous. There's not a ton of it, or wasn't, with faculty, with teaching higher level learners, practicing doctors using simulation. Clearly our ultimate goal, team and safety behaviors. So what we wanted to do was create this big, giant interprofessional team training course, right? The thing that we identified, and I think this is pretty well known, a lot of medical error, a lot of patient safety, a lot of the problems in our system come from teamwork and communication, right? It's a big, complicated system, leadership, closing the loop, all these things, the Swiss cheese model, the system, right? It's not so much individuals as it is the system and the teamwork. However, it's a big, ambitious product, right? And when we started talking about it, the idea of bringing all of our faculty into the sim lab to do team training right away, we knew initially could create a little bit of consternation, a little bit of resistance. People like, oh, teamwork, yeah, leadership, we get it, yeah. We're not so interested. And taking people who weren't interested or were used to coming into the sim lab, used to being taught by us, a bunch of young educators trying to teach, your chairman, for example, in the sim lab was different for those folks. So we didn't want to take a concept that was hard in a technique that was new or they're not used to, And we feel like it was a setup for a struggle and potential failure. So baby steps first, right? How do we get them in the sim lab? How do we get our faculty learning and hearing us and learning from us in a way that felt safe, that felt useful? Then we warm them up to the big concept stuff. We warm them up to the large scale stuff. So pause for a second, right? Med ed sprinkle, right? Kern's 6 steps, right? So we had a problem, right? Now we cheated a little bit. We had an educational strategy in mind up front, right? So we sort of like started with 4, which is not the right way to do it. And that's part of why we had to sort of build around this other direction, is we were sort of taking a tool that we wanted to use and using it to meet our larger objective. Now we thought it was a good tool, but right, ideally find your needs, create your goals, then make sure the tool fits it. You know, I have this conversation a lot when folks come to me, they want to do sim courses for their clerkship, for example. You know, like, oh, we want to do more sim. Can you help us make a case? We have this really good idea for a case. And I said, no, don't tell me the case. Tell me your objectives, right? What's the goal of the sim? What are you trying to teach? Then we'll create the tool, right? Then we'll create the course. So we cheated a little bit by starting with the simulation. But so what we did is we thought procedures are a good place to start. And we talked to our chairman, we talked to medical directors, we took a look at what are some of the things that they see as a need for their faculty. And this theme of low frequency, high risk procedures came up a lot. You know, as our faculty, they do these things not too often, and especially with the ones that have residents under them, they may do them never, but they're supposed to be supervising them. And they thought this is a high risk thing that we could address pretty easily, right? And procedures were a nice first baby step because it's easier buy-in. It's way easier for me to tell my faculty, like, hey, come in and play with this cool trainer I have, right? Come in and do this procedure you haven't done in a while with your hands, right? So it's a little practical, it was good for buy-in. It was an immediate need identified by our leadership. We chose 3 procedures and started with those. Now, I'm gonna come back to this in a second. Let's do some old school med ed trivia. I don't know if we can unmute people, but does anybody know who this guy is? I know it's super hard, old black and white pictures. I'm not hearing any. I don't see any hands up, so that's okay. We'll come back to him. I'll give you a hint. He talks a lot about the motivation for your adult learners and why they're there to learn and how to use that to make your training better. Right, because you know, if they're not interested in being taught, you know, if they're there because they have to be, then you're not likely to get engagement. They're not going to come away with that, with learning, right? You guys are here because you want to be here, right? So I have a great opportunity to take advantage of that and teach you some things, and hopefully you'll take it away more. And we really wanted people to come out with some benefit and want to be there. And I'll talk about how we did that in a little bit. Procedural training lends itself really well to deliberate practice, right? Salt Bay number 2. The 10,000 hour rule, right? Intense repetition, all right? Super hard question, all right? I used to put on this slide famous people like football players and baseball players and Yankees and Mets. But I went a little more obscure this time. This is my new favorite sport. This is lacrosse. And if anybody can, you know, message me or put their hand up and tell me who this guy on the left is, I'll buy you lunch sometime. I'm not seeing any hands. No Long Islanders here. No lacrosse folks. Right, this is a guy called Blaze Riordan, right? Blaze is his first name. It's his real first name. Super cool. As a sports player, he is probably. Oh, did somebody get it? No.
Alfred Berger.
So this guy is probably the best lacrosse goalie in the world right now. And the guy on the right is a little easier guess, I'll bet. The guy on the right is my son, who thinks he's going to be the next greatest lacrosse goalie. And he's doing deliberate practice. So, right, you don't get better at something by just doing it, right? You can't stand in front of the goal with a stick and have somebody throw a ball at you 1,000 times. And you'll get a little better, maybe, but you can't become a master without coaching, right? You can't become a master without feedback. And it has to be informed feedback in a specific way that allows repetition to get better, right? This is the idea of deliberate practice. This is what we're doing in the sim lab all the time, right? My son here is doing it in COVID area in the basement with the video because, you know, we couldn't get outside with the real groups. But that said, right, the little steps, right, the little pieces, micro skills, this is what makes us better at what we do. Okay. Where are we? Oh no, I clicked it too fast. Okay. So we created 6-month modules. We took as a procedure because we knew our faculty would come in at different levels, right? Some people do these procedures all the time. Some people haven't done one in 10 years. So we did a flipped classroom model. So we sent to our faculty the review of how to do the procedure, videos on the procedures, readings on it ahead of time. So you could take your practice, and those that needed more time and needed review could do it. And those that didn't could blow through it and didn't really have to think about it too much. Then you could come in and do your practicum, right? We put the stuff out, come in, try it on, do some hands-on work. And we gave them a lot of tips and tricks. So what we discovered was there's the basic aspects of doing the procedure. And then there's all the little practical things that you don't think about. In ultrasound world, they call it buttonology, right? I could show you how to put the ultrasound and see the vein, but what if, do you know how to change the gain? Do you know how to move the target? If the battery is blinking, do you know what that actually does? What happens if it becomes unplugged when I'm trying to do my airway? We started doing a lot of little practical things that we found the faculty really appreciated. You know, every time we came up with something like, oh, I didn't know that's how that worked, right? You immediately went from crossed arms here, I'm here for my mandatory sim session, right? And then you give them a couple of things that are helpful, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, that was useful, right? Now, that said, you know, tip and trick if you're dealing with faculty, we made it mandatory. We got guys like Dr. Jagoda to buy in and tell the faculty they had to come. Because if we made it voluntary, faculty are tough to get, right? You got to be there for a few hours on a Thursday morning or whatever. I'm busy, I got stuff to do. Why am I coming in? If I make you come in, you'll be there, but by goodness, you better give them some value when they show up, right? Now, of course, pre and post surveys, right? We looked at comfort, we looked at experience, we did some rating, right? This is our learner buy-in. We looked at the procedure in a number of ways. When we did our assessment. So once they did their hands-on, we brought them back individually and we did an assessment with the idea of, you know, really making sure they owned it before they left the sim lab. We created a checklist of the skills, right? Modified Delphi. This is one of my favorite things in education in these checklists, which really just means a bunch of us got together and made this up, right? There's a proper Delphi method that exists in the world. Every publication I read talks about a modified Delphi. We just changed it to make it a little more convenient. But we also added to that checklist a psychomotor score, a Dreyfus novice to expert scale, basically trying to look at the global skill. If I'm trying to assess you on a skill, you can do that checklist, each step individually correctly, but I don't know, drop the ultrasound twice, or it takes you a half an hour to place the ultrasound or the airway, even though you did it correctly. So we really wanted to capture sort of a global picture of like, when you're doing this, do you look like an expert, right? Does it look like you're comfortable? Sort of a subjective measure to go along with the objective checklist. We did these every 6 months. We brought you back. We took a look at, you know, did you find 6 months later that previous module useful? Did you use it? We gave you another test after 6 months to see if you're retaining your skills. We really tried to be very thorough at measuring our outcomes in a lot of different ways, right? A lot of rigor. Now, one of the things we failed to do, and I'll tell this story because I think it's an important one. We had one rater for each individual. You know, so I brought Dr. Jagoda back, and he did his procedure, and I measured it, and I gave him feedback, and we coached on it a little bit, and that was the end of it. We did this over time, and then we discovered a year in after our second module, the Mount Sinai Hospital faculty were way better at the first procedure than the Maimonides faculty. Now, was that real? I don't know. I like to think so. Like, yeah, we're really good at it. We're such good teachers, right? But we had no way to know if we had a rater problem. You know, was it really just because Dr. Strother is a super nice guy and overrates his faculty, or Dr. Aguirre, who's our sim director at Maimonides, is a real tough cookie and scores everybody lower, right? So lesson one for me is inter-rater reliability. You know, if you're going to have somebody assess you, especially with something subjective, you better have more than one person do it. And ideally, if you're doing different sites like we were doing, I would have had somebody from the other site rate my people and vice versa, to really make it objective as possible, remove some of the subjectivity of knowing the people involved, and create some inter-rater learning from that. So that's one of my biggest lessons from these things is you can do all the fancy metrics in the world. If your reliability of who's measuring those metrics is off, you could be in trouble. All right, now the other thing we took away from this, Salt Bay, this way, Kirkpatrick, right? These are levels of outcomes. We want to get to results, right? We want to make sure whatever we're teaching you turns into real life improvements, right? It's hard to measure results, right? We measured reactions, right? Reactions like, I liked the course, that was fun, right? We measured learning, did you actually get something out of it, right? That's our second best outcome. Slightly harder than saying that we liked the course. Behavior, did it actually change what you did afterwards? We tried to measure this with our 6-month follow-up, right? Trying to look at, did you actually do the procedure differently? Did you get some outcome or some change in your behavior? But we couldn't really go out and watch people do it. And we found it was next to impossible to prove results for this because it's a low frequency procedure. They don't happen very often. It's really hard to show that we made outcome changes. And this was one of our struggles. Was later on, we went back to talking about the malpractice company, for example, and they said, well, how do you measure that all this work you did, all this stuff actually made a difference and reduced malpractice and changed outcomes? Like, well, we think it did, right? We hope it did. It seemed pretty cool. And so it's one of these leap of faith situations that isn't totally ideal. All right, so, you know, of course, this started things, right? And always you want to think about your outcome, right? Part of the reason we did all these measurements and all these setups and the needs assessments is so we can get out there and talk about it. We gave some panels. You know, one of the things that really caught on, we must have done this panel like 7 times, is how do you get your malpractice insurer to pay for educational stuff? That's really cool, right? People really bought into that, were very interested about how we created that relationship in that situation. And of course, talks on the results themselves and what we did. If you're really lucky, you'll get invited to Med Ed Grand Rounds. You get to talk about the stuff you're doing. But you know, putting yourself out there, talking to people really makes a big difference. You get a lot of help from those things. A lot of people come up and give you suggestions, but also, you know, clearly as an academic, we want to get out there and put our product out there and disseminate what we're doing and share it with others. So moving into the next step. So after our first module, for example, we asked for, what else do you want to do? You know, here's this thing, you know, give us some suggestions. What other procedures, what other things you want to do? One of them was central lines, which happened to be the next thing we had planned to do. So that was nice, as everybody was suggesting, like, oh, good, you're interested, so we're going to do it. And people kept mentioning this code training and team training thing. Our own faculty spontaneously were mentioning these things as something they would like to see in the future in the sim lab in a similar course. Right? Which of course was our plan all along, right? Team training, you say, right? Excellent. Now we can move into the stuff that we really want to do, the big stuff that we really wanted to take on. Malcolm Knowles was my friend from earlier, right? Andragogy, adults are self-directed and expect to take responsibility for their own decisions. What does this mean for me? That means that your learners need to want to be here. Right? We want to give them value. We want them to be interested in what you're teaching. They need to see why they're there, right? They need to have self-direction, right? What you're talking to me is relevant to what I'm doing. So I'm trying to keep this broad. So I keep doing my Salt Bay medical education tidbits because you may not be a sim educator. And if all I did was talk about sim, I'm not helping you out any. We got to generalize what we're doing, knowing that you have different roles that are going to affect your motivation for being here. And of course, immediately, right? Immediacy. If I need to solve a problem right now, I'm going to pay attention. If I don't think I'm going to use this for 15 years, I may not put my camera off and walk away and go make my lunch. So motivation, right? So we decided that the way to take this on, because a lot of our faculty had learned things like team steps, which is sort of those communication tools and safety tools, and we got a lot of that stuff already. We wanted to take our skill in debriefing after a simulation and turn it into team debriefing in the clinical arena, right? Now I say the word debriefing, a lot of people freak out, right? Because debriefing in many people's heads in the hospital is, oh my God, we had this terrible case, and 3 weeks later, my medical director is gonna make me sit in a room with a bunch of other people I don't know and tell me why I'm a terrible doctor and what I should do differently next time, and boy, you better hope you don't get sued, right? This is not that debrief, right? This is the folks debriefing themselves. This is my team after my event, talking about what happened just now. And what we could do well and what we could do differently in the future. And we used a lot of concepts, debriefing and good judgment, safe containers, Delta Plus, all these very wonderful sim nerd debriefing things to build this idea of how do we create this debrief. So I'm not going to get into it. It's a different talk. And you know, if I'm kind enough to get invited back someday, maybe we'll delve into it. But we're going to move past some of the sim specific concepts and really just talk about this debrief. Clearly, our goal is to improve patient safety, right? Debriefing's been shown to be useful. You know, there's a lot of actual evidence out there that teams that debrief get better as teams. They function better. They exhibit outstanding team behaviors more frequently. After cardiopulmonary arrests, programs that debrief have had better outcomes over time. So we know this is actually useful. It's been shown to have outcome results at the end. So this is something we really wanted to take on. This is the kind of debrief we're talking about. In the EMS world, they call it a hot wash, right? Because they're still hot because they just walked out of the burning building, right? It's not a cold debrief with your medical director 3 weeks later. It's right now, we're still sweaty, we're still exhausted. Let's go through it and talk about what happened and get better as a team, right? So forget the mannequins, right? We want to talk about real people. We want to debrief this, right? We want to debrief the chaos that happens in our actual daily lives. The mannequin's great, it's interesting, blah, 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 but what about real life? What do I do in the real life? Now, of course, we're all sim people, so you're gonna see it show up again, right? But here we were a little more proper about it, right? We started with our identification of our problem, our needs assessment. We saw that this is something that was needed. It wasn't being done. We know that it's useful. We narrowed our objectives down, and then we put our educational strategies together. Fortunately, once again, these nice folks at FOJP and HIC were behind us. And we got experts together from Maimonides, Montefiore, Mount Sinai. This is one of the most rewarding things I've ever done because I got together with really smart, really engaged, interesting people from 6 different hospitals to put this together. And that's one of the things I can't say enough. If you get the opportunity to work with other folks and put courses together at multiple places at the same time, it's amazing how much better your product is. It's amazing how much more rigorous and interesting and you know, people come up with you know, why didn't you do this and that, and really makes the outcome better. So these are some of the people I owe a lot of thanks and gratitude to. So we had to get together. What's the best point of care debriefing tool? We were making this up a little bit. It's been out there. Now there's a lot of literature on this. This was really pretty new 5-6 years ago when we started doing it. More and more places are taking on this clinical debriefing stuff. So there's a lot more literature out there about how to do this. But we sort of had to take the little bit was out there, do that Delphi process, put together what we think is best practice. Had to teach everybody how to do it, and then had to teach everybody how to follow up on it, how to make sure it hangs around and actually had the results outcome that we want. Quick view of one of the tools we put together. One of the most important things that we did with this was we wanted people not just to debrief, not just to talk, but to write down the things that came up and the solutions you think were important to fix those things in the moment, feed them to us, and then we will implement those strategies and make your life better. So don't just talk, actually come up with solutions to the things that are going on, right? And this is a real big focus of ours. So how did we decide to teach this? We used a little bit of everything. We were very fortunate in having the resources we did, and that we did an offsite at NISIM, which is this massive, amazing, modern, cool center down at NYU, to host it. And we started with content, patient safety behaviors, team behaviors, what is a debrief, how do you do it, lectures, small groups, video demonstrations. We played videos of teams behaving and then had people talk about what was good and bad. We did some live demonstrations. So we would play a team doing a code, and then we would pretend to be that team and we would debrief ourselves. It was a little hokey, but it was kind of fun, and it gave people the idea. But we really tried to hit all the different learning styles. Here's some stuff you can read. Here's some stuff you can talk about. Here's some small group things. Really looking at a complete picture of all the things we wanted to teach them over the course of the morning, getting up, moving around. We'd have everybody together, we'd break them up, we'd bring them back together, we would move them again. Keeping people awake, keeping people moving and thinking and talking. And then of course, once we put it all together, we brought them into the sim lab, because that's what we do. Now, the cool thing about this was, what we did is we ran the team. So these were doctors and nurses together. So this is interprofessional learning all day long. The whole day had doctors and nurses at the site with each other, learning from each other. And we generally let people, in the morning, people hung to their own institution and their own people. We rearranged people a little bit in the afternoon to break it up and get some new folks, because we wanted people to be a little bit uncomfortable with the team they were working at. Because one of the hardest things about this whole debriefing process is to run a conversation with a bunch of people you may or may not feel confident in running a conversation with, right? Strangers, different people, moving people, different teams. So we set these cases up, and the cases are almost unimportant because they were a prop, right? We ran them through these sick patients, and we always set something up to go wrong. The supplies were wrong, the information was bad, some crazy thing would happen, just to give them something safety-realized to talk about. But the real sim was actually the debrief afterwards. As we let those teams take the tool we've been teaching them all morning, come off to the side after they went through the case, and debrief what just happened with each other. And that was the real sim, was the debrief itself. That's what we wanted them to practice. We had a lot of fun with the cases. We let people switch the roles around, and we had nurses intubating and doctors giving meds, and because it didn't matter. What was important was practicing the debriefing. Each person, each team, doctor, nurse, didn't matter, got to lead a debrief. Because we really wanted to make sure that everybody had the ability and the confidence to do this. So this is Kolb, right? Kolb talks about the learning cycle. This is sim stuff, but I think it applies to a lot of what we do, right? You get a concept. So we taught them this concept of teamwork and debriefing. Then you experiment with it. Like you go on, you try it on, you get an experience doing something in the ER, doing something on the floor, talking to a patient in a particular way. You take that experience, your brain integrates that experience, that memory, you think about it a little bit, and then it builds it into that original concept, right? I learned this, I tried it, this is what happened, so I'm gonna build that back into my concept and try it again, right? This is Kolb. And this is really what we're driving. Now this was great because we got to touch all the Kirkpatrick steps, right? We got the initial reaction to the course. We looked at whether people actually learned something. We got their own reflections on, did they gain from this? Did they get something out of it? Did they learn the material? Then we got to look at behavior and results, right? Take this back, do it at home. Let's see how it goes. So what did we measure, right? We measured attitudes and comfort surveys, right? That's the easy stuff. Everybody does that. That's your reaction to the course. That's, do you get your learning? And it's a challenge. We didn't test people, right? We sort of took their word for it, right? It's the old, like, do you feel more comfortable with this material now? Yeah, sure, right? Not as rigorous as it could be, but it was something. We looked at behavior. Did you actually go home and do the debrief? And this was the nice thing, because we had people record these, we could actually see that they were using it and how frequently they were using it. And then we looked at what were the results, right? Did we actually find issues? Did we find safety problems? And did we fix them, right? First 6 months or so, we did about 160 of these over the 5 different sites. So, a couple a week, we were warming up. It got more and more frequent as time went on. Discussions were being had about leadership, communication, situational awareness, right? How often do you talk about situational awareness on a regular day, right? Pretty cool. We actually got people to have these conversations a little bit. And did we find any safety events? Boy, did we. 1 out of 4 of these had some sort of event on the near miss, high risk thing, something somebody perceived as, wow, that could have been bad, right? Now, do we have a bad safety event with 1 out of 4 of our cases in the year? No, right? But it just shows how good we are at workarounds, right? The monitor didn't work, so we got that one, right? Now the monitor not working is a major safety problem, but it didn't affect the patient because we got the other one real quick and we worked ourselves around, right? The protocol didn't work correctly. We didn't know that guy was coming. All these things that happen that are system problems, that are safety issues that, we sort of sit around afterwards and complain about. We don't necessarily do anything about them. This is the beauty of this, is people were writing them down, bringing them to their QI committees, bringing them to their leadership, and we were fixing things. This is a little sample of what we did, but 60% devices and equipment when these things came up, right? When they came up, this was the frequency. Protocols were often mentioned, knowledge and decision-making, teamwork. Now, the cool thing at the bottom here is this is, I think, a year in. We were looking at how frequently are we actually creating solutions to these things. And when we pulled this data, of the 275 issues we'd identified at our 5 places, 60% of them already had a solution in place or being worked on. I'll share with you my favorite. We had an 18-year-old young man roll into the ER, clearly septic. Febrile, tachycardic, looked a little crummy, not a code, not a resus, but a really sick patient. The team saw the patient, they talked about it, they did great stuff. They debriefed afterwards and realized the sepsis BPA, right? The little alert in Epic that's supposed to pop up and say, hey, this person might be septic, right? That we're sort of dismissing and being annoyed by all day long with all of our febrile patients. Never fired on this kid. And they're like, this is the most septic kid we've seen in a month, right? Why did this not come up? How do we not see this? And when they looked, and we dug into it a little bit on the back end, we discovered they had set up the sepsis parameters differently for children and for adults, right? How did they define children? Less than 18. How did they define adults? Greater than 18. 18-year-olds were not setting off the sepsis alert ever, right? Pretty interesting stuff, right? And it's the kind of thing, if we'd never sat down and nobody really dug into that in a debrief or wrote it down, it could have taken months or who knows how long to figure it out and could have caused an issue, but we found it, we fixed it, it never caused a problem. So results from our course, this is one of the most satisfying things we get. It's like, we're making our place better because of the teaching we did. Now, the other thing that came out of this that I want to talk for a minute about is what happens when the funding dries up, right? They're not going to give us money to get this huge course, this nice center with lunch and all these things that we did forever, right? I see this a lot of times with these big courses. It's happened to us with Team Steps several years before. We brought everybody together, we did this great team training, team behaviors, leadership, yada, yada, and it didn't do anything about it. Everybody came back, fired up about it for about 4 months, and then it sort of fades away and people get busy and don't stop thinking about it. So what do we do after the course ends, right? How do you make sure you have sustainability? One answer is make sure that your course isn't super expensive and doesn't need a bunch of funding, right? So we created a bunch of mini courses. Local, on-site, smaller versions of this that we could do with our own teams in our own place that didn't need the big resources, taking the concept we'd learned from the larger course, winnowing it down and making it sustainable. Operational follow-through, sharing the wins, telling people that we fixed the sepsis BPA, or hey, you mentioned that there was no, the monitor didn't work. Hey, by the way, we fixed the monitor, right? Showing people that their behavior, that what they did made a result, made their lives better in the end, keeps people doing what you want them to do. Champions were super important. In involving the residents. If you ever really want something to happen on a frequent basis, get the residents on your side. Once we taught them this idea and like, hey, we just taught all your faculty how to do this thing and it's really great and it's going to be super helpful for you. All of a sudden every recess the resident's like, we should debrief this. Can we debrief this? Can we talk about this afterwards? And boom. they keep happening, right? Involve your young learners, especially if it's a learning opportunity for them. They will make sure it keeps happening. Okay, to make this great course, it's pretty cool. You're very satisfied, high fives all around. Now what do you do with it, right? We said we wanted to circle back to this concept of turning teaching into product. So talk about it, right? What am I doing now? The cool thing about this particular project is it crossed a couple of bridges. We were able to give talks to the simulation folks and the education folks about how we took these med ed concepts and brought them to the bedside. And then we got to talk to the bedside folks, the Emergency Medicine Society meetings, about how we took the SIMS concepts and built them into emergency medicine. So it was interesting to variety of different audiences, which really worked well for us. Make a panel. I said earlier, I talked about use other people, do multi-centered teaching, work with other educators. Conferences love panels. 3 or 4 people talking about a topic is way more interesting than listening to me for 45 minutes talk continuously. Different questions and answers and perspectives. And the nice thing is we had the ability to use multiple site people to talk about it, but also multiple specialties. And that really gave us an opportunity to create some interesting panel work that people really liked listening to. The other thing I discovered through all of this is a wonderful way to double publish your educational work, right? There's 2 ways to kind of put your work out there as an educator. One is the curriculum itself. If you make a great curriculum, right, you can put that out there. Places like MedEd Portal, there's a variety of really excellent ways to put your educational work out in the universe that didn't exist before. And it's growing every day. Now, if you're gonna publish your curriculum, do Kern right? Do this correctly, have an assessment, know the need. This is why I did the course. This was the need this course addressed. I did my research up front and made sure what I was teaching fit the needs of the learners I was teaching. Then use good concepts to development, right? Use your medical education concepts, be able to talk about them. This is why I chose SIM. This is why I chose a lecture. This is why I did small groups, because this theory I know is going to use this thing to make sure my learners get out of it what I think they're going to get out of it, right? And then clearly you have to assess your courses. If you don't assess your course, you don't measure the outcome, you don't make it better after the first time. 1, you're not doing your job, but 2, you're not going to get it out there, right? Good, rigorous assessment. And what did you do with that assessment to improve the course the second time you taught it makes it much more publishable when you're putting your curriculum out there. And then clearly if there's results, right? If you found that this teaching method that you just came up with really made a big difference and people learned better, if you found that your course you taught made a real clinical patient safety outcome, you get to put that in journals, right? That's where you write your article. Here's the outcome of what I did, and it made a difference later. So you can really look at what you're doing in a couple of different ways. There's the research part of it. Did the technique do what I thought it was going to do? Research on the educational technique itself, and research on did what I taught create an outcome that was useful to our specialty, to our learners, to our school, to our patients. And that's your more traditional research article. And there's no reason you can't do both of these things for anything that you put a great course together for. Questions? I'll wrap up there. And look, I got 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chris.
I didn't talk too fast, I hope.
So